Good afternoon. I'm Suzanne Nossel. I'm the Executive Director of PEN. On behalf of our 3,500 writers, editors, and translators here in the United States and more than 20,000 around the world, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the closing event of the 10th Annual PEN World Voices Festival. It's been a whirlwind, and a great many of you have been part of it. People have traveled from Europe, Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and South America, and all around the United States to join us for more than 50 events, large and small, all over New York City over the last week. PEN World Voices is the United States' only international literary festival, and the only literary festival perhaps in the world that has as its express mission the defense of free expression and the advancement of dialogue on the tough issues that can divide us. The alchemy of this festival has always been bringing together leading American and European writers with original, exceptional writers from all over the rest of the world who could tell it like it is in ways that Americans don't often hear. This week we've tackled the global food crisis, NSA surveillance, revolution and revanchism in the Arab world, African corruption, the dangers to Indian democracy, transgender identity, farm worker roles and rights, literature and war, literature in prison, the future of the public intellectual, poetry, translation, the interview, Balkan literature, Scandinavian literature, and dozens of other topics. It's all done through a dizzying array of personalities, venues, and formats, debates, death matches, seated dinners, puppet processionals that make New York City into a moving and movable literary feast. I want to take a moment to acknowledge Jakab Orsos, Beth Weinstein, and their incredible, tireless, and inventive team that has put all this together. If you want more of where all this came from, we do year-round events. Please visit our website, pen.org. Follow us on social media. This is not just a one-time event. So I hope you've sampled the banquet and been tantalized and tempted by what you've tried. I also hope and trust that you're going to enjoy this evening's dessert. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jakab Orsos. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Laszlo, Jakab Orsos, the director of the festival. This was it. A really intense week. It was fabulous. Thank you all. And I really have to say that without our team, a small, really lean team, we couldn't make this happen. So thank you all. Thank you, PEN, all the PEN staff, and the small festival team. You guys are amazing. Thank you. Tonight's lecture is the hallmark of every festival. This is the Arthur Miller Freedom to Write lecture. It beautifully encapsulates the mission of PEN and the PEN World Voices Festival. We're talking about freedom, how essential freedom of expression is, and how we cannot imagine our life, our intellectual life and public life without fundamental First Amendment rights. Named after Arthur Miller, a former PEN president, and really a fierce advocate for freedom of speech, this is really a pinnacle of the festival. Former speakers before tonight's speaker, just to name a few: Orhan Pamuk, David Grossman, Umberto Eco, Wole Soyinka, Christopher Hitchens, Salman Rushdie was here 2 years ago, and Justice Sonia Sotomayor. Before we present our speaker tonight, let me bring Peter Godwin, the president of PEN American Center, on stage. Ladies and gentlemen, Peter Godwin.
Good evening. Oops, sorry. Each year, as Jakab just told you, the Arthur Miller Lecture, given here at the site of Lincoln's famous 1860 attack on slavery, draws to a close the PEN World Voices Festival. Arthur Miller, who was a former PEN president, said that PEN is the voice of cultures truthfully addressing one another rather than governments or armies in confrontation. The object is not to win something, but to illuminate something. He believed that the most convincing example, if not proof, of humanity's oneness is the universality of the best literature. Let me take you back for a second in time, a little more than 10 years ago, when we were still in a state of shock in this city, when 9/11 cast an existential pall over us, when residents were leaving for safer, more bucolic climes, and when foreign visitors were shunning our city. In this moment, Salman Rushdie recognized that our response to 9/11 was going to be the great civilizational test of our time. He asked this: will we become our enemy or not? Will we become repressive as our enemy is repressive? Will we become intolerant as our enemy is intolerant? Or will we not? Will we fight with different weapons? Weapons of openness and acceptance and seeking to increase the dialogue between people rather than decrease it. This is the big test. It is a test that Salman Rushdie passed with distinction, for in those dark hours, he had both the vision and the grit to launch the PEN World Voices Festival, America's first international literature festival. His action then brings to mind the actions of Robert Shirley, who commissioned a new church in Leicestershire, even as his side was defeated in the English Civil War. The inscription over the doorway is an optimist's charter. It reads in part as follows: in the year 1653, when all things sacred were throughout the nation either demolished or profaned, this church was founded by Sir Robert Shirley, whose special praise it is to have done the best of things in the worst of times, and to have hoped them in the most calamitous. The PEN World Voices Festival is a house of free expression and cultural openness that Salman Rushdie had the imagination to raise in the most calamitous of times. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Salman Rushdie, the founding chairman of the PEN World Voices Festival of International Literature.
All right. This is what it's like to retire, I guess. Somebody should give me a gold watch. It does feel a little bit like handing over my baby for adoption. And I think, that's an ambiguous feeling. I think all of us who were at the beginning of this journey that's now been going on for 10 years are really proud of what we made. Francine Prose was one of the board members with me at PEN when we had this idea. And I just want to recognize the enlightenment of that board and of successive PEN boards since then, and of the people who've actually run the festival. Mike Roberts, who was chief executive of PEN at the time, Carol Llewellyn, who took over and curated it for several years, and now, of course, Jakab Orsos and Beth Weinstein, who've done such a fantastic job these recent years. And beyond that, the staff of PEN, the volunteers who come up, who make it all happen. And I think we all know it's a tough town. And to put a big cultural event into the calendar of this town is not an easy thing. And so in the end, all we can do is put it out there and see if you show up. And what is great is that if I could treat you, this audience, as a signifier of 10 years of audiences, we couldn't have done it without you. So thank you for showing up and making this mean something. Finally, I just want to say that I think we couldn't be putting this festival into better hands. Colm Tóibín, who will take over from me as chairman after he finishes delivering the Arthur Miller Lecture. You see, no such thing as a free lunch. He's not only one of the world's leading writers, but he will bring a whole new imagination and dimension to this, and I'm delighted to be handing over to him. And so, without further ado, Colm Tóibín.
Thank you, Salman. It began, as many things do, indeed as this event has begun, as a dream. In the summer of 1901, while staying at Cool Park, the house which had belonged to Lady Gregory's husband and now belonged to her son, the Irish poet W.B. Yeats had a dream, which was, quote, almost as distinct as a vision, he said, of a cottage where there was well-being and firelight and talk of a marriage. And into the midst of that cottage there came an old woman with a long cloak. And she was Ireland herself, and she was personified as Kathleen Ní Houlihan, quote, for whom so many songs, Yeats wrote, have been sung, and about whom so many stories have been told, and for whose sake so many have gone to their death. The play that came from that dream was performed as Kathleen Ní Houlihan in Dublin in April 1902. In the text, which is in the Berg collection in the New York Public Library, there is a note in Lady Gregory's handwriting, "All this mine alone." And then towards the end, this with WBY. It was clear to some even then that it was, when it was first performed, that most of the play was written by Lady Gregory, who was a playwright and translator, but the official author on the programme was W.B. Yeats. Now, more than 100 years later, it is in both his and her collected works. The play had on its first performance an enormous impact. This was helped by the vivid sense of domestic space and the naturalistic dialogue and talk of money and marriage. But the impact itself was caused by the sudden and mysterious transformation of an old woman into a young woman, quote, with the walk of a queen, unquote. The transformation caused by the arrival of French forces in the west of Ireland in 1798 to assist in the struggle for Irish freedom. The audience understood that this change in the woman represented Ireland and what could happen to Ireland were they to devote themselves to Ireland's cause. The hall was packed every night. The woman, both young and old, played by Yeats's muse, Maud Gonne, seemed to lure the imagination away from everyday materialism towards the heroic, from ordinary speech towards the poetic. The play showed how important and indeed disturbing images of transformation could be in a society in which there was repression, paralysis, political stagnation, a strange vacuum. George Bernard Shaw later said that it was a play which might lead a man to do something foolish. In the way it affected the audience, Kathleen Ní Houlihan made clear how powerful words, poetry, and pure and risky theatrical images could be in a place where people had learned to distrust political speeches and the language of the official world, a place in which there was a hunger for something in the public realm which was new and could be trusted and almost believed. It was left to writers to create the dream, and soon the dream of transformation became a dream of revolution. Years later, in a poem, W.B. Yeats would ask the stark question, quote, "Did that play of mine send out certain men the English shot?" This then would be an easy story to tell if Yeats and Lady Gregory themselves had been revolutionaries, ready only to use art to create political change, ready only to use their work in the theatre to inspire an audience, to undermine the civil power. The story is more complicated because the play was merely one of their moods. Like the moods of most artists, their moods came in many guises. They believed in the glittering imagination, the image as something unstable and free, something without limits. They did not toe any party line, but in the work they would do in Ireland over the next 25 years, they would have to navigate in waters where others believed that art had a single purpose, or had solid aims, or believed in setting limits to what a writer could say, or what images the theatre could portray. In any discussion of censorship and freedom in an emerging or changing or fragile society, this story is instructive and salutary. The play helped the reputation of W.B. Yeats with the growing number of Irish Catholic patriots, some of whom had been disturbed by the less than flattering image of the Irish peasant and the use of superstition in a previous play of his. In every society where there is an urge to censor, there is always in place some rawness, some grievance, a fear of the outside world, a hunger for images which are comforting and comfortable, images that cover the national or social or religious wound, or attempt to heal it. And there is a deep and often visceral resistance to images which expose the wound or throw salt on it. This is what makes the battle against censorship in religious societies or developing societies so difficult to manage. Thus, the real trouble began when Yeats and Lady Gregory and the Abbey Theatre, which would dedicate itself to present new Irish plays to an Irish audience in Dublin, began to produce the work of the contemporary playwright John Millington Synge. It mattered, of course, that all three were Protestants in a country where the majority were Catholic, and all three were cosmopolitan in a country which was becoming increasingly insular. James Joyce, in an encounter in his great story, The Dead, would dramatize the clash between the protagonist, Gabriel, who writes for an English newspaper and takes his holidays in Europe, with Miss Ivors, who tells him that Irish is his language, not English, and that he should go to the west of Ireland on his holidays, not Europe. Synge wrote his plays about Irish peasant life with wit and complexity at a time when many people wanted solemnity and simplicity, when they wanted the theatre to protect rather than provoke. When his play, The Shadow of the Glen, in which Nora Burke, a married woman, runs away with a tramp, was performed in 1903, the attacks on Synge began. And they did not come from England or from any government, but they came from Irish patriots who were attempting to idealise and recreate a new Ireland. Arthur Griffith, for example, the founder of the nationalist party Sinn Féin, wrote, "Mr. Synge's Nora Burke is not an Irish Nora Burke. His play is not a work of genius, Irish or otherwise. It is a foul echo from degenerate Greece." And Maud Gonne, who had played Kathleen Ni Houlihan, joined the attacks. "Mr. Yeats asks for freedom for the theatre. I would ask for freedom for it from one thing more deadly than all else, freedom from the insidious and destructive tyranny of foreign influence." 3 years later, riots broke out in the Abbey Theatre at a performance of Synge's play, The Playboy of the Western World, and they continued for a week. They broke out because members of the audience were shocked at the way in which Irish women were presented on the stage as earthy and sexually alive, in which there was no effort made to idealise the Irish peasantry, but instead an effort was made to have them seem comic, grasping, and of course dramatically forceful. It is important to remember how much images matter in a fragile place. In the cartoons in English magazines, for example, it was common for the Irish figure to appear as feckless, untrustworthy, and at best, and at worst, violent, alarming, and simian. In order to create the conditions for Irish patriotism to thrive, the image of the Irish peasant would have to be cleansed, idealised. Irish women would have to seem more pure, more fully Victorian than their English counterparts. The play was a disruption of this project by a brilliant imagination. When it was performed in America in 1911, the Irish American audiences hated it even more than their counterparts at home. They had greater fears since many of them were employed as an underclass. They threw rosary beads and stink bombs at the stage. The New York lawyer and art collector John Quinn believed that the play had a right to be heard in the American cities. He wrote, "The policemen that ought to be put in the theatre ought to be Irish policemen. Then the town, New York, would have an edifying spectacle of Irish policemen ejecting Irish rowdies from an Irish play." Quinn had to rush to Philadelphia to have the actors released when the entire cast of the play was arrested. Once more, it is important to remember that those who led the group to stop the play were themselves vulnerable. They were Irish emigrants in America who sought to idealize the country they came from in order to improve their image in the new country. It was their feelings of weakness or grievance and openness to mockery that caused them to riot. It was their sense of themselves as beleaguered and a powerless underclass that caused their objection to the play. The battle over the work of Synge in America happened at a key moment when emigrants were caught between tradition, both remembered and imagined, and assimilation, both feared and desired. In Ireland, too, the rioters were caught between a country balanced between tradition and modernisation. Both patriots and emigrants expected art and image to assist their uneasy cause. They wanted art merely to offer relief from a challenge they felt from within, rather than intensify or make public that challenge. When artists, on the other hand, insisted on their right to freedom of speech, then the clash was messy and bitter, and the possibility of dialogue absent and compromise impossible. It would be easy then to say that Yeats and Lady Gregory and their friends were ready to take on the patriotic rabble in the cause of artistic freedom, to represent broad cosmopolitan values against narrow and restrictive ones. But this story is instructive to anyone interested in the battle against censorship and the freedom to write, because it shifts and changes. Between the Irish and the American riots over the Playboy of the Western World, another play was performed at the Abbey Theatre in Dublin, which would change things for Yeats and Lady Gregory. It was a short play written in 3 weeks in 1909 by George Bernard Shaw. It was called The Shoeing Up of Blanco Posnet, and Blanco was an American horse thief who at one point in the play decided to threaten Almighty God. There were also some foul-mouthed women in the play and dialogue bordering on the blasphemous. Like the Playboy of the Western World, there was something in its tone, as much as in the particulars, which could easily offend those who wanted work in the theatre to be tame and easy. Shaw's play could not be performed in London because London plays had to be submitted to the Lord Chamberlain's office, a division of the royal household which could and did censor plays until as recently as 1968. No wonder Samuel Beckett called him the Lord Chamberpot. But by accident, this man's remit, even before Irish independence, did not extend to Dublin. Thus, Yeats and Lady Gregory decided to perform the play in their theatre. The British authorities in Dublin, housed in Dublin Castle, now took the place of the Catholic and patriotic rabble. They pointed out that the freedom from the Lord Chamberpot's scrutiny was nothing more than, quote, an accidental freedom, and it should not be taken advantage of. Lady Gregory and Yeats attended several heated meetings with the British authorities while the play was in rehearsal. There was a threat, and a real one, that the theatre's patent could be withdrawn or not renewed. In a wonderful moment, a moment we should all perhaps write up in lights behind us, they asked Lady Gregory if she could see no way out, none except our being left alone. She replied dryly. Shaw was delighted. Like many artists, he loved a row. Threaten that we shall be suppressed, he wrote, that we shall be made martyrs of, that we shall suffer as much and as publicly as possible. Tell them that they can depend on me to burn with a brighter blaze than all of Fox's martyrs. Dublin Castle continued to threaten the loss of the patent, closure, and a fine. In her memoirs, Lady Gregory wrote of walking downcast with Yeats through the lamp-lighted streets after one of the meetings, and then suddenly coming to the decision that they would confront the British and go ahead, or they would, quote, never be trusted again. The play opened to huge publicity on the 25th of August 1910. Yeats took full advantage of the occasion, insisting that while there might be some truth in the idea that we are not truthful to one another here in Ireland, we are certainly always true to ourselves. And then he had a good go at the English. In England, he wrote, they have learned from commerce to be truthful to one another, but they are great liars when alone. Patrick Pearse, who would lead the Easter 1916 rebellion in Dublin, was there on the opening night. And as with many others, he forgot the earlier problems he'd had with the theatre. One of the strange things about those who wish to censor and silence is that when they give it up, what they have done seems to dissolve for them, not to have happened. Artists and writers arrested one year often come to be revered afterwards, and if they are lucky enough, soon afterwards. Censorship often looks stable, but under pressure or over time, that stability can fade. Now Patrick Pearse could write in praise of Yeats and Lady Gregory and their theatre for, quote, making a fight for Irish freedom from an English censorship. Lady Gregory reported that when a stranger outside the theatre was asked what was happening, he replied, "They're defying the Lord Lieutenant." The cheering of the theatre was taken up in the streets outside. Since Dublin Castle in its defeat remained silent, the only sour note came from James Joyce, home briefly from his exile in Trieste, who reported, quote, "Dubliners care nothing for art, but love an argument passionately." And despite all the noise and praise, Shaw's play was, in his opinion, not very good. The battle with a weakening British establishment was simple. The forces at work were clear, as they often are when a state apparatus sets out to censor. You wait for openings to come, and you take advantage of them as they did. Or helplessly, you watch things become more rigid and more cruel. But you know the enemy, and the enemy is not solid or stable. Governments are by their nature uneasy and temporary. While forbidding, banning, repressing belong often to their mission, as much as collecting taxes or building highways or having their photographs taken, their policies dart and move, and thus they are often open to pressure, which is what makes PEN's mission so necessary and so important, just as they are often ready to pretend that they're not open to pressure. Political power is a form of weakness. The word, in all its slippery ambiguity, is a form of strength. But in the defeat over Shaw's play in Dublin in 1910 meant that the British administration would not last more than another decade. They were already living in fear. This was an early sign. But in the aftermath of the rebellion of 1916 in Dublin, Yeats and Lady Gregory faced the most dangerous censor of all and the most difficult one to defeat or confront. That is the censor which lives within us all. That is the idea that we might or can or do censor ourselves. Both Yeats and Lady Gregory were surprised by the 1916 rebellion, even though they had known many of the leaders personally. At the beginning, Lady Gregory saw the inevitability of executions. But slowly, between April and September 1916, as public opinion in Ireland began to change, her mind changed too. And she began to feel that there was something heroic about the leaders of the rebellion who had been executed by firing squad by the British. Yeats too came to feel their heroism, and he wrote one of his most famous poems as an argument with himself about what had happened. The poem, written in September 1916, is called Easter 1916. Although the poem interrogates the use of violence, asking, was it needless death after all, for example, and includes the lines, too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart, the poem's refrain was what would be noticed and quoted most. It read, all's changed, changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born. At the end of the poem, he listed some of the leaders as though they were heroes. Lady Gregory's only child, her son Robert, was fighting for England in the First World War at the time, as were 11 of her nephews. Robert would die in the war in 1918, and 4 of her nephews and a grandnephew would also die. Added to her losses was that of her favourite nephew, the art collector Hugh Lane, who was killed when the Lusitania was torpedoed in 1915. Lane had left a codicil to his will, which gifted his large collection of valuable paintings to Dublin. But the codicil was not properly signed, and the paintings thus legally belonged to the National Gallery in London. Lady Gregory wanted to convince the British government to operate according to the spirit of Lane's will and hand the paintings over to Ireland. This involved slow and careful diplomacy and lobbying. She travelled to London over and over. Her argument would not be helped, she believed, by the publication of Yeats's poem, Easter 1916, since Yeats was so publicly associated with her. Any writer who has ever worried about causing offense to family or friends or to local community or to a whole country should take instruction from the delay in publication of this important public poem. While Yeats read it a few times to friends, he created at first only a limited edition, warning the printer not to show the poem to anyone. Then a Dublin magazine published just the first 16 lines. The full text of the poem, Easter 1916, did not see the full light of day until 4 years after its composition, when it appeared in its entirety in the New Statesman in London. Yeats did not publish it in his 1919 volume, The Wild Swans at Coole, but waited until 1921 to publish the poem in volume form. These two figures who had stood so firmly against censorship had effectively censored themselves, but their action was also ineffective. The paintings they wanted for Dublin remained in London. Their timidity about the poem made no difference to the dispute, which would last for more than 90 years. The paintings were not to be shown in Dublin until 2008. The last battle Yeats and Lady Gregory fought for freedom of speech occurred in 1926, when Dublin was no longer a city of the Empire, but the capital of the Irish Free State. 1926 was the 10th anniversary of the 1916 rebellion. Those who fought and died were heroes now, and so too were those rebels who had survived, some of whom were now in government. And the widows and family of those who had given their lives for Ireland had a special sacred place in the new country, as did the memory of the patriot dead. A play about the Rising in the Abbey Theatre, called the National Theatre, would then, one imagines, be a solemn event, a fitting commemoration, a requiem for the brave and an anthem for the new society. Instead, the playwright Sean O'Casey wrote a play called The Plough and the Stars, in which the ordinary people of Dublin, who used the rebellion as an excuse for looting from stores, they were the heroes. They were the people who lived on their wits. Patriotism did not mean anything to them. In the play, the Irish flag was taken into a pub in which there was a prostitute. The pieties and aims and antics of the patriots were mocked. As the new state came into being, Yeats, who had won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1923, and Lady Gregory offered to hand the Abbey Theatre over to the state, make it an official theatre, an offer that was wisely declined by the government. Instead, it was decided to offer the theatre a government subsidy, making it the first English language theatre in the world to be publicly funded. The price of the subsidy was a new member of the board, an economist called George O'Brien, who would be the government's semi-official representative on the board of the theatre. Slowly, as this new play, The Plough and the Stars, was in rehearsal, the actors began to object to lines. Soon the text was read by the new director, George O'Brien, who wrote to the other directors of, quote, the possibility that the play might offend any section of public opinion so seriously as to provoke an attack on the theatre of a kind that would endanger the continuance of the subsidy. He also listed individual words that he felt should be removed, as though he were the new Lord Chamberpot. In a statement that has relevance to any arts organization, including ones here in the United States, which accepts a subsidy, whether private or public, or which has a list of rich donors and depends on their support and goodwill, Lady Gregory was ready to bite the hand that fed her theatre. In words that might be usefully written up in every boardroom of every theatre in the world, she said, if it's a choice between our freedom and the subsidy, we will choose our freedom. While there were some small cuts, the play went ahead, and the subsidy remained too. She won her freedom and kept the subsidy, and maybe there's a lesson in that too. Once more, however, there were riots in the theatre. One of the most formidable women in Dublin, Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, whose husband had been summarily shot by the British during the 1916 rebellion, whose father had been a nationalist member of Parliament, and whose sister had been used by James Joyce as the inspiration for Miss Ivors in The Dead. She led the attacks on the play, Quote, "In no country save Ireland," she said, "could a state-subsidised theatre presume on popular patience to the extent of making a mockery and a byword of a revolutionary movement on which the present structure claims to stand." Despite the objection from her and from other widows of those who had fought in 1916, the play went on every night. Yeats was amused at the idea that if now he had to call the police, it would no longer be the British police, but the people's own police. The Plough and the Stars and the Playboy of the Western World remain part of the theatre's repertoire to this day. Thus, the battles were won, but the war itself for freedom of expression in Ireland was soon lost. In 1929, the Censorship of Publications Act became law in Ireland, allowing any citizen to complain to a government-appointed board about a book or a publication. Among the many writers whose books were banned between then and 1967 were John Steinbeck, Graham Greene, Scott Fitzgerald, Hemingway, Thomas Mann, and Evelyn Waugh. Most Irish writers, including Samuel Beckett, had books banned. In 1950, Robert Graves described Irish censorship laws as the fiercest literary censorship this side of the Iron Curtain. In 1965, the young Irish novelist John McGahern had his second novel, The Dark, banned because it had some mild scenes where an adolescent masturbates. McGahern also lost his job as a teacher in a Catholic school. His treatment at the hands of the censors in the church caused shame in the country, which was attempting to entice foreign capital and investment, which wished more and more to be seen as a normal modern democracy by the rest of the world. Ireland had not imprisoned its writers. It had instead made sure that they left the country, and many, including Beckett and McGahern and Edna O'Brien, did. Ireland had imprisoned the books rather than the writers. But the country made clear that no writer, or indeed any serious reader, could feel at home in Ireland, that the word was too dangerous. I was 12 when the law changed and liberalised. Within a few years, you could buy most works of modern literature in any bookstore. John McGahern, who returned to live in Ireland, became a figure much loved and admired and honoured for his work. Edna O'Brien became an icon. There's a bridge called after Samuel Beckett. What was strange was how normal this came to seem, how right, and how the draconian system in place that banned so many books was hardly ever mentioned again. It was studied by scholars of censorship rather than spoken of in the streets. But it was important to remember that before the new freedom, there was repression, and that this in turn came from a sense of fragility in a new country, in a place that did not feel itself fully formed, a place that feared the outside world and remained suspicious of any image which was not familiar. It came also after a battle for freedom in the theatre that seemed to have been won, only to be lost when it came to books and magazines. The censorship was also introduced at a time of economic stagnation. Once money moved, and there was free trade between Ireland and England, say, and the possibility of Ireland entering what was then called the common market, it seemed that books would have to come too. And pressure from the outside world mattered. The country became deeply concerned about its image, and that concern became greater than the need to control what its citizens read. But for all of us who lived through that change, a change I witnessed again in Spain in 1975 when the dictator Franco died, it meant that we understood two things. First, that the urge to riot in a theatre to stop actors being heard, the urge to ban books, the urge to threaten to cut subsidy, are almost built into our nature. They lurk always in the shadows, especially in societies where there are divisions and pressures and fears, or sudden and uneasy change, but maybe they lurk everywhere. Second, the need to resist these urges which can be both shadowy and substantial, both threatening and pressing, which weaken and poison the richness and potential of our lives, requires single-mindedness, vigilance, cunning, knowledge that the enemy is within as well as without, and an absolute belief in the idea of the glittering mind, the power of the shifting and uncertain image, a belief in the challenge of the word and the often awkward presence of the new. The doctrine that these things are fundamental to us, to our way of living in the world, to our humanity, means that we must work using examples from the past, using all our energy towards the right for others as well as ourselves, to be let alone to imagine, to write, to read, to share, to publish, and to be heard. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Colm Tóibín. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Francine Prose joining Colm Tóibín. Francine Prose.
Hi. Hello. First, I wanted to say thank you. It's such a beautifully written speech and so informative and eloquent at the same time. Really a pleasure. I read the text this morning and then listening to it now. And when I read it and I heard it, I almost felt nostalgic and kind of jealous of a time when people cared about literature enough to riot in the theaters. I mean, it's hard to imagine this, something like The Lion King provoking a similar response, although it probably should. So I was wondering what you thought about, and then of course I remembered Salman's experience and Susan Sontag after 9/11, and I thought, be careful what you wish for. I wondered what you thought about the situation in this country now, when we can pretty much write what we want and be pretty sure that it's not going to change anything.
I think it is strange here, for example, that at the power of something like the New York Times, the fact that people who don't live in New York seem to believe it's their newspaper. That if you look at other countries, for example, Spain, France, England, Ireland, that there are 5 or 6 newspapers you can choose from, and the journalists who are uncomfortable in one place can move to another. Readers who want 2 or 3 different opinions every day, and foreign correspondents covering, for example, the big, places where the big things are happening at the moment, will not just be managed by a set of editors with one perspective, but by another perspective or another perspective. So that in England you can get diversity from, for example, the Daily Telegraph, which is conservative on some issues, but whose reporting of the facts especially foreign facts, tends to be very good, to the Guardian, which is also left-wing, but also if you read a news report in the Guardian, you can absolutely trust it. But you have that diversity with the Times in the middle, and the tabloids also, oddly enough, despite some of their antics, that some of their news reporting, even their editorial stances are different. So that is certainly one issue which stands out in America. And I suppose also the way in which something you mentioned like 9/11, the way in which if you put on a play on the 10th anniversary of 9/11, in which you said things that made people feel very angry, and you put it on in the right place, I'm not sure where that would be. But if it was as offensive as Sean O'Casey's work was, I'm not sure you wouldn't get. And also, if you showed Abu Ghraib, on HBO, and if you showed it from the other side, and if you showed the Americans as drunken, for example, lecherous, vicious, only, without showing their humanity, I wonder what would happen to HBO.
A subscription service. When I was reading the text, I thought, as I was reading along, I thought, I wonder when he's going to talk about self-censorship, and then you do. So I wondered if you could say a little more about that and how that actually works, because it's very, very complicated.
Well, you know, it works in a small country like mine, I suppose, much more obviously in a way than it might work here, which is that I come from a small town, and literacy has been around for a very long time, and books are read as forms of gossip almost, and you know, putting something in which might in some way offend someone in the town or your family or expose some area of yourself, that would be something that you have to constantly examine your own conscience about. Are you leaving something out? And I think, for example, in my case, if you're gay, as I am, that you would, you know, at certain times of your life worry, oh my God, you know, it's fine in Dublin, it's fine in London, it's great in New York, it's even more fun in San Francisco. But am I going to put it into my novel and make it so clear that I mean it, that it's about me, so that my aunt can say, oh my God, this is the last thing we need at the moment. You know, in other words, that sort of family, which is, I suppose, a metaphor for a wider family, is something that, you know, but also the idea of exposing yourself in fiction and a feeling there are certain elements, certain things about yourself that you're not quite prepared to expose or dramatize. And that's something that we've sort of making ourselves more bland than we actually are, or sweeter than we are, is perhaps something that writers should be vigilant about.
So how do you get beyond it? I mean, certainly we all face it. How do you find the courage to tell yourself it doesn't matter what your aunt thinks, or you can deal with it, or?
Well, I mean, I think that in other words, if you're ever accusing anybody else of something, I mean, if you're ever accusing the Chinese government, for example, of doing what they do, I think it's always worth going inwards first and then last to say, is there anything I'm doing? Is it in my nature too? And if so, how am I doing it? And so I think it's just a question of creating an environment whereby if you're ever in the accusing business, as so many of us are, it's so easy, it's so much fun just to find someone and accuse them of something. And you're usually right, they are usually doing what you're accusing them of doing. But I suppose it's what Yeats's phrase is good, isn't it? He said, out of my arguments with others, I make rhetoric. And out of my argument with myself, I make poetry. But that somehow or other, the work we do as artists involves an argument with ourselves. It doesn't mean we have to spend our lives being outspoken, because we have a right also to pure inwardness. But that inwardness too can contain very many things that could make a reader very uncomfortable and make us even more uncomfortable if we were to dramatize it properly.
What about the temptation to say the thing that you feel that you're not allowed to say just because you feel that you're not allowed to say it?
Well, it's a question of identifying that, though, isn't it? And it's also, I think it might be more important sometimes, however, to write well. You know, to say that my job is to make my sentences work. And that if I start worrying all the time about, oh my God, am I confronting myself? Am I filled with zeal over various things? I'm not going to allow the playfulness and the sort of slipperiness of fiction or of image making to actually matter as much as they do. I'm not going to, you know, allow the private life. So it's an odd business being alone in a room, working with silence for readers who will, in general, read in silence, because so many different things can happen. You can disrupt somebody's life by a single sentence, which might just have in its rhythm something oddly disruptive. So it's not a simple matter, this.
So let's talk about the festival. Plans, ideas, importance?
Well, the issue, I suppose the mission is that, the first one is that insularity has become a real problem for those of us whose first language is English. that English is sweeping across the world in this funny way. And all you have to do is look at the figures of the number of books the Italians translate, the Germans translate, and the number of books then that are translated into English from foreign languages. And realizing that that two groups of people are the poorer for this. One, the people who speak English, who are simply not getting the best work being made in other languages. They're simply not being translated. And the writers themselves who are writing in languages that are not even minority languages, but the ones in minority languages are in a worse position, who are simply not being heard. Now that's an interesting form of censorship. And therefore, the mission of the festival is not only to air, for example, large questions of, say, national identity or of political importance that arise in other countries that we need to know more about, and that writers may tell us a great deal about a great deal better than, for example, the ambassador or the consulate or indeed journalists, but that actually simply the works themselves, the novels, the poetry, and the presence of those figures from what's become a world we don't know as well as we should, in the city that is meant to be this great cosmopolitan place. So I suppose it's a way of combating two forms of silence, I think it matters enormously, and I think the bigger the audience for the festival is, the more this will change, because it does have to change. It isn't something that as writers or as readers or as citizens even, that we can let happen and think it's fine because English is such a great language, it will just move slowly and take over the world. Why should we? I mean, this is vital for our lives, and therefore, I think the matching of such a festival with PEN is terribly important, and the vision that Salman had after 9/11, realizing that New York is more likely to close now than open, and that the more outside voices you hear, the more awkward voices you hear, but that this could be voices with mere, what I'm going to use the word mere ironically, literary value. In other words, some writer who simply writes beautifully in a language that you don't know, and you need to know about that writer, but also writers who have news for us about what's going on in other societies.
Yeah, the statistics about how few works are translated into English are really horrifying and embarrassing, too.
So I suppose the pressure would be then to say, look, if you can build an audience for a writer whose work isn't known, then the pressure is off in a way the publisher. Look, it's much easier to say, look, we can publish this writer in English. We can spend the money. We can take the risk. So in other words, it is an effort to change the world. I mean, to change our world, and it is part of the general mission that PEN has to, for freedom of expression and for the opening up of ideas, in a free way.
So, speaking of the festival, let's ask Salman, our founding father, to join us. So what are you going to do in your retirement, Salman?
I this novel to write. I think I'm going to go do the day job and let Colm be distracted.
So do you want to talk a little bit about the beginnings of the festival and the importance and how you think it's changed and developed?
It was, you remember, because we were on the board together at that time, it was a very troubled time in New York, and beyond New York in America. A lot of anger here, a lot of anger aimed at America, a kind of dialogue of the deaf, in those times. And as somebody not American, but making his life here, I felt that as a loss on both sides, and just thought it'd be great to restart it. And I mean, we literally had no idea what we were doing. To try and put a literary festival into the middle of this endlessly crowded environment. We had this problem that we could overlap with the Tribeca Film Festival, and is that the same audience, and would anybody come to see us if they're all going to the movies? And we tried to have conversations with the Tribeca Film Festival saying, can't we just separate these dates? And they say, no, screw you. What are you, writers? You know how much they're respected in the film industry. So in the end, we just thought, okay. And we managed to raise, one of the principles of this was that we had to raise extra money for this, that we couldn't take away from the work of PEN to do this. And we thought we'll see how much money we can raise, and we'll have as much festival as we can raise money for. And then, we didn't know what size of rooms to book, because we thought, is it going to be 50 people, 75 people, etc. And instead, the great joy of the festival has, first of all, been to see how enthusiastic the audiences have been, and secondly, how predominantly young the audiences have been. Because one of the things that really worried me as president of PEN, as anybody who runs an organization like this, is the problem of an aging membership. And are you still relevant to the next generation? Are you saying something to the next generation that it wants to hear? Or are you just, an old fogey? And I'm worried about that with PEN. And one of the great things about this festival has been how many younger people it has brought towards PEN, who've come to events in the festival and got interested in the work of PEN and wanted to, join it, be part of it. And I think that's been a wonderful extra benefit. So I think we're all very proud of it. I was so interested in what Colm was saying, using Ireland as an example, because it's such a clear example in many ways, and the self-censorship issue. I think it's very difficult to write truthfully. It's very difficult because one of the problems of writing truthfully is that other people don't like the truth that you tell. There's a wonderful passage in, I think it's in Philip Roth's novel The Counterlife, where the character of Nathan Zuckerman's brother argues with him and says, you keep telling these stories about our family, about my mother and father and me, and I don't remember them like this at all. This isn't what happened, but because you're the writer, everybody thinks your version is the truth, but it's not the truth according to me. And I think there is that. I remember, when I published Midnight's Children, I was worried about what my family would think. And I worried that my mother would think that I was kind of telling tales that I shouldn't, and that my father, with a literature degree at Cambridge, he would get it. Instead, exactly the opposite happened. My mother totally got it. She said, yeah, I can see that's not you, that's not me, that's not your father, it's a story, you're telling a story. Completely got it. My father got really cross.
Well, I always naively assume that people are going to thank me for telling what I think is the truth.
Yeah.
And then I'm always shocked when that doesn't happen.
No, and then, that was at one end of my writing life, and then at this end, I decided to do the unwise thing of writing an autobiography. And then you really, you're standing there with floodlights taking your clothes off. And that's frightening in another way. It's frightening because of exposure. That if you're going to tell the story of yourself, then you have to do that. You have to, and that's not frightening about how other people react. It's frightening about what you're saying about yourself. So I think writing, it's just people don't realize. I think that writing it's very scary often because of the business of telling the truth, which is necessary, but very, very scary. Not because of, violent reactions or censorship, just because of the terrible pain of telling the truth.
Yeah, it becomes a compulsion after a while, though, too. It's like having Tourette's in a certain way. You just can't.
Yeah.
You can't shut up.
Yeah. No, I do think it's a kind of disease. I said this when my memoir came out. I said that, even like at this moment, which is like the worst moment of my life, it's like the bottom of the barrel, and I'm really not in particularly good shape. But even at this terrible moment, there's my voice sitting on my shoulder, whispering in my ear, saying, "Really good story."
Save it for later.
Yeah, exactly. And, that's a disease. Incurable.
Well,
unless you're Philip Roth, in which case he seems to be cured.
Or so he says.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you both. It's been extraordinary. Thank you, Colm. Thank you, Salman. And ask Jakab to wrap it up for us.
That was so good.
Thank you, Salman. Thank you, Colm. Thank you, Francine, Prose. Ladies and gentlemen, the 10th edition of the Pen World Voices Festival is officially over. It was a great ride. Thank you. See you next year, and thank you for your support.